Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα σας. Είμαι ο Απόστολος Μαγκυριάδης. Καλώς ήρθατε στον Επίλογο. Έχουν περάσει 3 εβδομάδες από την εκλογή του Ντόναλντ Τραμπ στην Προεδρία των ΗΠΑ και ο κόσμος όλος προσπαθεί να αποκρυπτογραφήσει όψεις του μέλλοντος για το 2025. Αυτό θα επιχειρήσουμε και εμείς απόψε με την βοήθεια 2 αποκλειστικών συνεντεύξεων. Η πρώτη με τον Negreponte, έναν γερόλικο της αμερικανικής διπλωματίας, ελληνικής καταγωγής, με τον οποίο συναντηθήκαμε πρόσφατα στην Αθήνα. Έχει έρθει εδώ για το Φόρουμ των Δελφών και μιλήσαμε για το πώς η Προεδρία Τραμπ μπορεί να επηρεάσει τις διεθνείς εξελίξεις τα επόμενα χρόνια. Η δεύτερη με τον Άντωνη Σκαραμούτσι, τον Διευθυντή Επικοινωνίας της πρώτης περίοδου Τραμπ. Έμεινε σε αυτή τη θέση για 11 μέρες. Είναι ένας από τους πιο επιδραστικούς οικονομικούς αναλυτές στη Νέα Υόρκη, ο Σκαραμούτσι, και έχει πολλά να μας πει για το πώς ο Τραμπ διοικεί τον κόσμο, αλλά και τις διάφορες αιμονές που μπορεί να έχει. Νομίζω θα βρείτε πολύ ενδιαφέρουσες και τις 2 συνεντεύξεις. Ας τις παρακολουθήσουμε. Στις σημαντικότερες στιγμές της εξωτερικής πολιτικής των ΗΠΑ κατά το δεύτερο μισό του 20ου αιώνα ήταν παρόν. Στις διαπραγματεύσεις για τη λήξη του πολέμου στο Βιετνάμ, πρέσβη στην Ονδούρα, το Μεξικό και το Ιράκ, αντιπρόσωπος στα Ηνωμένα Έθνη, αναπληρωτής υπουργός εξωτερικών υπό την προεδρία του George W. Bush. Ο Negreponte, με Έλληνες γονείς και καταγωγή από τη Χίο και τη Σπάρτη, γεννήθηκε στο Λονδίνο αλλά μεγάλωσε στη Νέα Υόρκη. Αποφοίτησε από το Yale και μπήκε στο διπλωματικό σώμα των ΗΠΑ το 1960. Διετέλεσε μάλιστα και διευθυντής των Αμερικανικών Υπηρεσιών Πληροφοριών από το 2005 στο 2007. Έχει διδάξει στο Yale και στο George Washington και έχει λάβει αμέτρητα βραβεία για τις υπηρεσίες που έχει προσφέρει. Τον συναντήσαμε στην Αθήνα στο πλαίσιο επίσκεψής του που διοργάνωσε το Φόρουμ των Δελφών και μιλήσαμε για όλα τα ανοιχτά ζητήματα της εξωτερικής πολιτικής αλλά και την Προεδρία Τραμπ. Ambassador Negroponte, thank you very much for being with ERT tonight. Back in September, along with some other foreign policy officials, you endorsed Kamala Harris. What are your thoughts after Donald Trump won the elections?
Well, of course, I was disappointed that Kamala Harris did not win, but we have to accept the reality that occurred. It was a fair, calm, peaceful election. We're going to have a peaceful transfer of power, and I think that's good. And now we will have to deal with whatever situation arises.
Donald Trump's susceptibility to flattery and manipulation by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, chaotic national security decision-making, dangerous qualities. These were written in the letter to endorse Harris. Do you really have fears on how Trump will handle foreign policy?
I have concerns. I'm not sure I have fears, but I think here's what I consider to be the important point. If Trump is left to make these policies all by himself, I would be quite concerned. And US presidents have quite a bit of discretion and quite a bit of power. But there are other forces. As you know, we have a system in the United States of checks and balances. And now the checks and balances are going to be tested under a president like Mr. Trump.
But he's very powerful. He controls the Senate. He controls the House. He also controls the Supreme Court. Don't you worry about the checks and balances?
Well, but here's what I'd say is the countervailing argument. The Senate, for example, he wanted a certain individual to be the leader of the Senate, Senator Scott. But there was a secret ballot, and the secret ballot produced a different leader, a more conventional, strong Republican senator from the Middle West. So I think that you have to look for these pockets of strength. I think, don't forget, the country is just about evenly divided politically, 50-50, so that as passionate as the Republicans and Trump supporters are about their points of view, there are Democrats on the other side of that coin. And so I think you're going to see interesting political reactions and interactions in the months ahead.
He appointed Marco Rubio for the as a State Department's head. What should we expect?
Well, first of all, it's probably, I would say, the most serious appointment he's made so far. Marco Rubio is qualified for his position. You cannot say that about all of Trump's nominees. He was the minority leader of in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's an experienced foreign affairs expert. Here's what I think we can expect for Rubio. a shift to the right, no doubt about it, strong on issues like sanctions vis-a-vis countries like Iran and Venezuela. And you might see also a shift towards greater concern about what is happening in Latin America because of Rubio's personal background, especially in regard to the so-called Bolivarian countries like Venezuela, especially Venezuela.
Yeah. If I were to ask you to prioritize foreign policy for the current administration, for the Trump administration, how would you evaluate it?
I would start with immigration, even though I recognize that's both a domestic and an international issue, but he put so much emphasis on immigration during his campaign that he couldn't give a single campaign speech without mentioning the problem of immigration right at the very beginning. Then I would say Russia, China, Taiwan, those would be, I think, Iran, the main issues that he would be interested in.
Is polarization within domestic policies affecting, you think, U.S. foreign policy?
Well, there are different views. There's no question about it, and particularly on some of the issues I mentioned. Mm-hmm. I think there's concern amongst Democrats that Mr. Trump will soften, will lessen, diminish his support for Ukraine because of his relationship with Mr. Putin. Mm-hmm. And it remains to be seen whether that would be a wise course of action. I think that perhaps he better think about that one very carefully. So that's one example of an area where there might be a fairly significant difference. Another one would be, I think that Trump is likely to be tougher on the country of Iran than the Biden administration, although both sides have taken a hard line towards Iran, but I think Trump will be even tougher.
Right, but on the Ukraine front, do you sense that just because we've seen in the recent days that President Biden has harshened his stance towards Russia, allowing Ukraine to use some of U.S. ballistic missiles. Do you sense that when Trump comes to power January 20 and later, he might interfere in a way that can be beneficial for Ukraine?
My concern is in the opposite direction. My concern is that he will have more interest in trying to accommodate Russia. I mean, there are people who support him and who, even in his immediate entourage, who were against the last economic and military aid package in the Congress for Ukraine. So this is a question that is going to have to be discussed and resolved. I think there are differences probably within his own camp about what to do. Rubio is probably a strong supporter of giving help to Ukraine, but others are not, like the people, the new National Security Advisor, for example.
When I asked you about U.S. foreign priorities under the Trump administration, you didn't mention Europe, and in this continent we have a thorough discussion on the notion of strategic autonomy for the continent. My question here is, number one, do you sense that based on his previous administration, his previous tenure as a US president, he will ask pressure to Europe to pay more for NATO? Will he actually, is there any possibility that he will pull out the US from NATO? How do you foresee this relationship?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. The NATO alliance is the strongest alliance we have. We have 2 or 3 other alliances around the world that are of a similar extent and nature, like with Japan and South Korea and Australia. Those are the other 3. But NATO is first priority in the United States foreign policy, generally speaking. And the Biden administration has invested an enormous amount of effort and resources to helping support NATO, including the adherence of both Sweden and Finland recently to the NATO alliance, which I think was a great step forward and an amazing thing to have happen. I think undoing NATO is a rather hard thing to do, even if he wanted to. Now, you may remember when he was president the last time, he sort of tried. He gave them a hard time. Yeah. he said, you're not giving enough, and if you don't pay, then I won't defend you. That's not very diplomatic language. I think he came around to a sort of a meeting of the minds, a modus vivendi, if you will, with the Europeans, and I think eventually that's what will happen again.
Point taken. Having been the U.S. ambassador on the United Nations some 20 years ago, what do you think has changed in UN's role in maintaining global order?
That's a really good question. I mean, it still does a lot. And I think, you know, the UN gets criticized by a lot of people in our country, especially by the right. They don't even know what the UN does, a lot of them. And they don't know about the 10 or 15 peacekeeping missions that there are around the world that have saved a lot of situations. They don't know about the humanitarian work done by the humanitarian agencies of the United Nations. So there's a lot of unfounded criticism of the UN. Here's what I think is the problem in the United Nations. We have to remember the UN itself is not an autonomous institution. It's the collection of the different members and their individual actions and what they think and do. And especially amongst the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. And there has not been any kind of real harmony in the Security Council for 10 or 15 years. China and Russia have been on one side and the rest of the members are very often on the other.
On the other side.
So it's been a problem. It's limited the scope for action of the United Nations. But I wouldn't abandon it. I think that would be foolish. In fact, I would think it'd be height of folly. We all remember what happened when Woodrow Wilson failed to get us into the League of Nations. And if the United Nations didn't exist, we would have to invent it, I'm sure.
And now actually Greece will hold a seat on 2025-2026 of a non-permanent member in the UN Security Council. I was wondering what kind of leverage it gives to a country of its size to participate in the body.
You know, being a member of the Security elected member is a mixed blessing, because it means that you have to take responsibility for issues that don't necessarily relate to your immediate interests, and sometimes it gets the elected members into difficulties with their immediate neighbors or with other countries. I remember Mexico, during my time there, regretted very much that they were on the Security Council because they were confronted with the question of Iraq and what the United States wanted to do in Iraq. And that caused tension in their most important bilateral relationship. So it's, I say, a mixed blessing, but usually I think it's viewed by individual countries as an opportunity to make a contribution to a larger whole. And Greece, of course, will be there not only in its own capacity, but as a country representing the European Union, right? Which has a coordinated policy towards different questions that come up at the Security Council.
We talked a lot about foreign policy. I would like to ask also for your take about the situation in the interior of the United States. It's a very polarized society. There's a huge debate about the situation of the economy. There's a huge about the woke agenda and how much it has dominated the politics of the Democratic Party, about identity politics and so forth. Do you sense that this country, because you have a great experience in politics for 70 years, I guess, do you sense that this country is moving towards the right direction, or you think that there's some maneuver that needs to be done?
I do think you identify issues that merit discussion and merit efforts to try to overcome some of these problems. Here's what I think is the main difficulty, is that there seems to be, if I analyze in my own mind, this is not a profession, I'm not a pollster or a political analyst of that kind, but I think that there's a divide within our society. There's a societal, a cultural division in our country, if you will, between the college-educated class and the less educated in our country, on the one hand, the people who have,
the ones that have been left behind, maybe, against those who understand
exactly. Ones who left
knows.
behind. I don't know if you ever read this book, Who Killed My Father? It was a French book, Qui a tué mon père? But it was all about a Frenchman whose father had been injured in an industrial accident, and eventually he died. But the main thesis of the book was that the system works for people who don't really need it, and that it doesn't work that well for people who need it. And I think we have many issues that need greater attention, like some of the addiction problems, mental issues, which are really affecting our society. So we have some internal work to do about our own domestic health as a society.
Because as an American diplomat, you do understand the importance of the US and the role it plays to the global chessboard, because it's a country that, it's still relevant, I guess. And whatever happens in the domestic policy in the US in some ways affects societies around the world. Don't you think so?
Yeah, and I think we still want to be relevant. We have, after all, we're linked to the world in many different ways, through trade, commerce, military, security, you name it, culture. But we have this major alliance with NATO. That's a lot of countries, 30, something like that. And the friendships that we have in the East Asia Pacific region. Major interactions with China, for sure. With Russia, maybe a little bit less so, because they're a more withdrawn country, if you will. And their trade relationship with us is very negligible. But with China, it's huge. It's like $1 trillion a year or something.
True. But don't you sense that the US-China tension might somehow, affect world order? We might end up in some kind of a new Cold War between those two powers?
Well, there's already a little bit of that going on, because you have a new leader who's a much more, well, first of all, he's not a Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping is not Deng Xiaoping. And he's a real Marxist. He's gone back to some of the old way of thinking. So I think we're all trying to deal with that. Also, their economy is growing, and their scientific advancement is very significant. And they're a power now to be reckoned with.
They have overpassed Germany in their automobile, right? Which is a huge obstacle for the German economy.
And in the field of scientific invention and so forth, they're advancing extremely rapidly. And I think that's one of the psychological issues that my countrymen sometimes have difficulty adjusting to. They don't want to think that China is a peer nation to the United States. Well, it is. And we have to reckon with that.
And if I were to ask you what you sense that are the major global challenges that the world needs to tackle over the next 10 years?
Well, peace, to start with. I mean, Ukraine and the Middle East are both very, very delicate situations. Those are hotspots. Taiwan and the Taiwan issue is also one of concern. But after that, we also have the global issues that people worry about. Environmental degradation, mass migrations. We see that with our immigration policy. It's not just Mexicans and Central Americans who show up at our southern border. It's people from all over the world. There's this great chain of migrants who are coming towards the United States because conditions in their countries are deteriorating.
I get the sense when I talk to experienced people who have lived around turbulent times that in the end you have some hidden optimism about the world order and about the fact that, we'll somehow figure it out. Am I right?
Well, hope is a great sort of transporter, right? Hope is what enables people to do things. And if you don't have hope, well then, why bother? So, yes, I think we have to care. I think we can do it. We're human beings. We've been given the mental equipment to deal with these issues. We've got to work together better. One of the things I would like to see, and it's an idea Mr. Putin had about 10 or 15 years ago, I'd like to see a meeting of the permanent 5 members, the leaders of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council of the United Nations. We haven't done that in quite a while.
Let me finally focus a little bit on the discussion about Greece. First question is, somehow in Greece, in Greek politics, we sense that we need to care about how the U.S. treats Greece. There's always a discussion on how much the U.S. president ever deals with the issues of Greece and Turkey and this whole region that we work on. So the question here is, do we care about the change of administration in the White House? Will the U.S. Foreign policy will have any shifts towards Greece?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I don't think you have to be concerned. I don't think Greece has much to worry about in terms of its relationship with the United States. I think relations are very good at this moment.
All-time high.
There's a large Greek-American community which has quite a bit of political and economic influence in the United States. You have a strong military. You pay more than 2% of your national budget for defense. So you're not going to get criticized for lack of contributing to NATO. I think there's a lot of interesting prospects for Greece, really, in the relationship with the United States and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. You're a member of the Greek diaspora.
Yes.
You have a great family, your ancestors. And my first question is, do you mind telling a few stories about your family and whether you follow developments in Greece? What's your connection now to Greece?
Right. Well, yeah, I'm very proud of my Greek heritage. Both my parents were from Greece originally. My mother was born in the States, but went back after the end of World War I and was brought up entirely. She was culturally Greek. My father came from a family that was from Chios, and in 1822 they left with the massacre of Chios, and their family ended up in Russia until the revolution, and then they came to Europe, and eventually we came to the United States when World War II began. I was born in England in 1939, and in July, and then in September we came to New York after the war started. My father's family was in Russia for a long time. They were grain traders, and if you remember in the Ukraine war, you remember all the fighting over Mariupol? Yeah, well, my grandfather was born in Taganrog, which is just across the border with Russia. It's about a 1-hour drive from Mariupol. It's where Chekhov was born. And it's where a lot of Greek merchants were.
There was a huge Greek diaspora.
There was a huge Greek diaspora, and a lot of it was involved in the grain trade, which, because Ukraine is such a, that part of Russia is such a, and that part of Europe is such a breadbasket. So that's a little bit the connection between the Greeks, the grain trade, Ukraine, Russia. So, yeah.
And further on, when you grew up, you learned Greek, and you spent some time in Thessaloniki also as an American diplomat.
I did learn Greek, so not very well, but I did. I was obliged to take Greek lessons. My grandmother taught me patriotic songs because it was during and after World War II. And then I went to Thessaloniki in 1973 to 75 and had a wonderful time as consul general there during that period. And it was just after the junta had fallen, so it was you talk about hope, it was a very hopeful time in Greece.
And you visit Greece?
I visit.
Do you visit often?
Yes, from time to time, not as much as I would like to.
Κύριε Πρέσβη, ευχαριστώ πολύ που ήσασταν στη δημόσια τηλεόραση.
Και εγώ σας ευχαριστούμε.